All right, guys, welcome back. First of all, really good job last week. Almost everybody got all of their work in. It looks like everybody's logging on pretty much every day. So, good job with that. Let's just keep it up as we keep going. I know this is a learning process. Also, I hope everybody's doing well, that you're staying safe, that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, and that you guys are hanging in there. So, um, good job last week. Let's do it again this week. So last week we talked. We spent pretty much the whole week talking about elections, political parties, and elections, and hopefully you guys sort of have the gist of it at this point in terms of our election process, why it was set up that way, um, notable moments in election history, and in terms of the political parties, the formation of the political parties, the role of a political party, the motivations behind joining them, et cetera, et cetera. So we covered that pretty thoroughly last unit last week. So this week we're starting with foreign policy. um, I'm not going to embed my face into this. I won't make you stare at me, but just take my word for it that the quarantine mustache is coming in very nicely. All right, so foreign policy, from sort of an existential point of view, is Uncle Sam or the United States federal government deciding how to balance the uh, best interest of the American people versus the best interests of the global citizens. In other words, how do you balance taking care of Americans while also trying to do your part as a world superpower to help the rest of the world? And we're going to break it down into 16 primary questions, 15 or 16 primary questions. Here's what we're going to answer today. Why is foreign policy in some ways the most important type of policy? Why is foreign policy in other ways the least important? What is it? What are the five elements that are included in foreign policy? What are the goals of foreign policy? What did George Washington, the first president, the precedent setter himself, what did George Washington urge the U.S. to avoid? From what we've talked about George Washington, from what we've said thus far, you guys could probably guess what Washington's views would be about foreign policy, but we'll look into that again. What is the most visible form of U.S. foreign policy on a global stage and a national stage? What are some downsides to using military force? Because a lot of our foreign policy revolves around where and when we're using, and to what extent we're using our military abroad. What are the main economic goals of foreign policy? And what does that mean in practice? In other words, what are our broader goals? And then how does that affect you, the American? And what does that actually look like? What is a third goal of foreign policy? We'll break down the three goals and the order of importance or the order of emphasis that is placed on them by the government. Um, Even more questions. Other ways the U.S. makes the world a better place. And with something like that, I personally think that the United States does make the world a better place. But like most things, or like anything in this class that is not completely objective, in other words, one plus one equals two. That's not arguable. That's objective. Anything that's subjective, that involves some element of your own interpretation or your own philosophical or emotional stance on something, I always urge you to challenge what I tell you if you're inclined to do so. We're going to look at environmental policy because that's a pet cause of mine. Environmental policy, specifically the relationship between environmental and foreign policy, that dynamic between protecting the environment and, again, protecting American interests and hopefully improving the world. Who usually wins that? I think that you could probably guess what the answer to that is going to be, but we'll look at that. Overall, in terms of the three goals, like I said, we'll rank it in terms of an order of importance, at least that is in order of the importance that the federal government places on them. And then finally, how is foreign policy made? Why can it be argued by me and others that it is the least democratic? What role does Congress have in foreign policy? How do interest groups play a role in foreign policy? So let's go back to the beginning. Last time, this is where I messed everything up. So there we go. All right. Why is foreign policy the most important? Foreign policy is the most important because it has the potential to affect the largest number of people, especially if you include environmental policy, which we should. In this class, we will. Also, foreign policy includes a lot of elements of economic policy. And economics, as we've talked about in this class, are very important. So, why is it the least important? Well, foreign policy is also the least important because it tends to have a minimal impact on how Americans think about their government, unless we're at war. And even then, not always so much. In other words, our foreign policy, what our leaders in the federal government, the foreign policy that they implement, compared to policies that are more domestic, in other words, that address things within the United States, compared to those types of policies, foreign policy is not a huge influence in terms of how the American people see their government. I do point out that wartime is often different. You had eras like the Vietnam era, where a lot of people were critical of our foreign policy. People opposed our involvement in Iraq. So wartime is different, but as a general statement, in terms of the impact that it has on most people's view of our federal government. And that is something that the federal government is very concerned about because, like we talked about last week, it's all about getting elected and staying elected. Anyway, what is foreign policy? For our class, we're going to define foreign policy as a collection of policies that determine America's relations with other nations and foreign entities. So, for our class, we're going to call it a collection of policies that determine America's relation with other nations and foreign entities. And there are really 5 different elements included in foreign policy. So, looking at the next question. What are the 5 elements that are included in foreign policy? Diplomacy, military and security policy, international human rights policies. That's a big one. These are all big ones, frankly. economic policies like trade and international energy, and then environmental policy. So diplomacy, military slash security, international human rights policies, economic policies, and environmental. What are the goals? Looking down at the bottom of the slide. Foreign policy, it's about providing security. But American foreign policy also seeks to create prosperity, success, and it works towards a somewhat idealistic goal of making the world a better place. When we say idealistic, that is usually a term that people assign to something that maybe is not. It sounds like a great idea. The motivation is terrific, but it's not likely to happen. And it could definitely be argued that the goal of quote unquote making the world a better place is a little bit idealistic, but it's also important, I think, that we try to accomplish that. All right, moving on. What did George Washington urge the U.S. to avoid, and did we do that? Well, as we've talked about over and over, George Washington urged the U.S. to avoid foreign entanglements. In other words, don't get wrapped up in the rest of the world's troubles. And we pretty much did that right up until World Wars One and Two. And the differences in those cases were that threats to the international order were seen as detrimental to American security. So even though the Americans weren't in much danger of being invaded by Germany, if you remember from your U.S. history class, Germany did try to get Mexico to attack us with the Zimmerman telegram. But even though it was highly, highly unlikely that Nazi forces were going to march on America, those issues, those quote unquote foreign entanglements were so epic that the United States saw no way of avoiding involvement. Not to mention, in the case of World War II, we were attacked on American soil. So you really can't ignore that. Military force, if we're looking at the next question, what is the most visible form of U.S. foreign policy? It's military force. It might not be the most useful. Maybe it is. So, what are some of the downsides to that? Looking at the third question. Well, use of military force has significant downsides, including costs, both in the terms of lives and money. It's also politically dangerous. While Americans are are usually on board with short, decisive, victorious military action, the longer a war drags on, the less support it tends to have. So, a lot of Americans, the idea of a quick, victorious military operation is appealing, or at least tolerable. But as wars go on, American people, as a general rule, tend to lose enthusiasm for that, and as a politician, that could be extremely harmful. So, what are the main economic goals of foreign policy? The main economic goals are to expand opportunities for the U.S., to promote foreign investment, so to try to get foreign countries to invest in American industry, maintain access to foreign energy supplies. When we say energy supplies, we're more or less talking about oil, and to promote trade policies that will keep prices low at American big box stores. Basically, try to make trade policies with countries like China that allow Walmart to sell you that radio for 50% less, or whatever the case may be. Not that you guys are purchasing radios, but you get the idea. So, in practice, that means that the U.S. maintains an active role in international organizations like the World Trade Organization that make and uphold free trade rules. So we are involved in various organizations, specifically the World Trade Organization, that try to sort of maintain this system. Um, okay, looking down at the bottom of the page, a third goal of foreign policy is to make the world a better place. That's important. And what is one way that the U.S. does this? Well, one way that the U.S. does this is through international human rights initiatives. The U.S. is party to many human rights treaties. We have somewhat complicated relationships with the UN and international lawmaking bodies, so we don't sign on to all of them. But we do have a role in many pieces of legislation and agreements, international agreements that have improved quality of life for people outside of the United States. What's another way we do this? Well, another way the U.S. makes the world a better place is through international environmental policy. Environmental policy has a domestic component, in other words, a component that affects us here within the United States, just like when we set fuel standards or rules for power plant emissions or dumping toxic chemicals. But since we're all on one planet with one environment, it's also a part of foreign policy. Who usually wins? I'm guessing you could all answer that question, but when it comes to conflict between environmental protection and economic growth, Americans tend to choose economic growth. And a lot of times that's a criticism of environmental activists, is that they quote unquote hate business. So that's enough of my soapbox on that for today, but let's keep going. So overall, in terms of foreign policy goals, for what comes first? Security. Security comes first. Second is economics, and making the world a better place is definitely a third, at least in terms of formal, official foreign policy. Well, how is foreign policy made? And why is it the least democratic type of policy the government makes? Um, at the top of foreign policy is the president, who the Constitution suggests is the nation's chief diplomat. The president has power to receive foreign ambassadors and negotiate treaties. He gets all the face to face meetings with foreign leaders, and he has authority to hammer out agreements. Remember that when the Constitution was written, most other countries were still ruled by kings, emperors, sultans. So we needed a single person to do the negotiating. President also has the advantage of being the decider, right, on crucial issues that might be good or bad, depending on whether or not you like his decisions. But the president's only one man, so most of the day-to-day work of foreign policy is relegated to bureaucrats. Bureaucracy is a word that's come up time and time again. So diplomatic work is handled mainly by the State Department, but they get a lot of help from the Defense Department and the intelligence gathering agencies like the CIA, the NSA, the DHS, because you want to have as much information as you can before you sit down to the table to negotiate. What role, if we're looking now at the second answer, the second question, What role does Congress have in foreign policy? They have a role in foreign policy, but it's a limited one. That might be a good thing. The Senate has the constitutional power to ratify treaties, but since a two-thirds vote is required, the president will often try to create foreign policy with executive agreements that only require a majority vote in both houses. That's usually easier to secure, especially recently. One way Congress has a big role in foreign policy is through its power of the purse. Again, money, money, money. It takes money to pursue a policy, and it takes a purse to hold money. So, especially in the area of defense, Congress appropriates a lot of that money. And contrary to popular belief, Congress hasn't budgeted a lot of money for other types of foreign policy, especially aid to foreign nations. Congressional committees, like those on foreign relations, they can provide some expertise, but not as much as bureaucracies, because congressmen still have to spend a lot of time running for reelection. And usually those elections don't hinge on their knowledge of foreign affairs, right? Joe voter in Ohio probably does not care if his congressman is very well educated on Middle Eastern politics. Maybe he is. Maybe Joe is particularly tuned in. But as a general rule, people are just more concerned with what's going on in their own backyard. So Congress can also try to limit the executive branch's authority. They can do that through hearings, like the one that targeted the State Department's handling of Benghazi. But they usually don't affect business as usual at the bureaucracy. They might force a few resignations, but they usually don't affect business as usual. And then finally, how do interest groups play a role in foreign policy? Interest groups are a unique element of American democracy. They can play a role in foreign policy in terms of shaping the agenda, but they don't do much of the work of crafting the policies themselves. So, like with domestic policy, interest groups are most effective when they're focused on a single issue, especially if that issue is narrow. Narrow meaning just like a very specific element. So interest groups that coalesce around issues, that gather and come together around issues, they've been growing in importance, especially as communication technologies enable these interest groups to get their message to a wider audience and to organize grassroots lobbying efforts. If you think about that, these communication technologies, as we're going to call them, what a huge role they've had in essentially every element of, well, that's a slight exaggeration, but they've just had such a tremendous impact on the exchange of information. And we've talked about that in several chapters, in several units. We talked about it, the significance of online access for candidates. But the same goes for things like interest groups and lobbyists. Like-minded interest groups can now come together. An organization in Oregon can send an email or do a video conference to an organization in Georgia, and you can get that solidarity, that unity between people who are all trying to achieve the same thing. So tomorrow we're going to talk more about the State Department and foreign policy. We'll talk about the current members of the State Department. We will later in the week, maybe tomorrow, maybe later on, maybe Wednesday, we're going to look at some of the most meaningful foreign policies that the U.S. has ever enacted. Because for the last almost, really for a long time, I'll just say for a long time, the United States has been probably the premier force in global affairs. Some people would argue that's a wonderful thing. Others would not, but that's the reality of the situation. So our foreign policies, depending on what issues they're addressing and how extensive they are, they can affect life for people all over the world, and that's something to consider. The fact that it's in terms of when we started out, we asked why is it the least important, because voters typically don't care, at least not nearly as much as they do about domestic things, and that's understandable. But just in if you're talking global, worldwide impact, foreign policy is our most significant. So, like I said, tomorrow we'll talk a little bit more about the X's and O's of the State Department. And later this week, we're going to look at notable foreign policy decisions. A lot of times around uh, issues concerning war, but other times that not being the case. So, with that, good job, guys. And there will be an assignment, a few questions just to make sure that you watch the PowerPoint. So, look for that. That's going to be called Week 2, Day 1 Summary Questions. So, week 2, day 1 summary questions. All right. Great work, guys. I will talk to you later.